Not everybody agrees that the repository pattern or even the persistence layer in general should earn a place in your architecture. And I see where they're coming from, so let me list a couple of objections that I've read and then answer them myself. The first objection is that they're simply too complex. In the original application architecture series, I talked about taking a tools-driven approach to software development. In other words, rely on the tools to build a user interface, then build a database, and then glue it all together with C# and some designers and so on. All right. So if you subscribe to this mentality, then the value of abstracting the domain layer classes away from the persistence layer classes will simply be lost on you. Yes, you can achieve results quickly if you use the templates, the designer services, the wizards, and so on to build your applications. Again, the problem comes in when you have to manage the change in the application, which we identified as the biggest challenge for software developers. But it's a valid concern in some types of applications. Does every single project that you work on need a persistence layer that's guided by the repository pattern? Or for that matter, does it even need layers in the first place? Does it need to be unit test driven or domain driven and use data transfer objects and the like? Absolutely not. You pick the appropriate tool for the job. Is it a weekend project? Forget everything I say. Use the tools in Visual Studio, in ASP.NET MVC or WPF, in the Entity Framework, and so on to just whip it out as fast as possible. If the project is intended to live for like 10 years, well then I would seriously consider the value of the layers and specifically in the persistence layer, the repository pattern, in conjunction with all the other pieces of the puzzle that we've discussed in the architecture series. So that's one way of answering the problem of complexity. No, it doesn't always fit in every scenario. Use it judiciously, but you should know what it is and what benefits it gives you. The second objection is that I've been there, done that. The persistence layer, or more specifically the repository classes, are not all that useful. So the other group, this group, objects to the use of repositories on the basis that they're not a useful abstraction based on years of using them. Perhaps the best arguments that I've found against the repository is by a well-respected member of the community here in his blog, Los Techies. His name is... what is his name? I'm sorry. Jimmy Bogard, or Bogard, okay? Bogard, sorry. But he's written a couple of articles over a number of years about this, most notably limiting your abstractions and then also favor query objects over repositories. And I'm not going to take the time to summarize his thoughts. Heck, I'll be honest, I'll defer to his experience and his wisdom on the topic. He seems to know what he's talking about here. But many been there, done that repository opponents argue that you ain't going to need it with regards to an abstraction around an existing abstraction like the Entity Framework. All right. After all, the Entity Framework is already an abstraction, and it in fact does seem to implement some of the features of a repository and unit of work design patterns. The only value then in wrapping an abstraction around your data access layer is to change out the data access storage technology. And they would say, how often do you really even need to do that? Almost never. They also argue that they can still unit test the domain layer classes that utilize a data access API by mocking and faking context objects and the like. And I see their point. I've never been on a project that required me to swap out the persistence layer. And heck, it would be nice to go straight to the Entity Framework and utilize linked entities inside my domain layer classes. And I've built apps that way. I understand the thought process. You lose a lot of the value of the Entity Framework when you kind of hide it behind this persistence layer. But I suppose I would just answer those and other related objections in this way. First of all, I don't know what Microsoft is cooking on in regards to data access. Just about the time I got my head around the ADO.NET 2.0, there were these rumors about the Entity Framework. And just about the time I understood the first version of the Entity Framework, they jumped from version 1.x to version 4.0. And once I understood the 4.0 version, they changed a bunch of stuff around in the 4.1 version, adding code first, DB context, and more. And somewhere in the middle of that, Windows Azure came out too. If I can count on one thing, it's for Microsoft to introduce new data access APIs and technologies, as well as user interface APIs and technologies more often than I change automobiles. Second, if all I needed was to just build for the short term, then I too would have reservations about investing so much time in building out all these layers, like I said before. But another part of me wonders what types of applications exactly are these critics building? And more importantly, do they have to maintain them long term? Years, not just months, for external clients, not just for their own uses. Or if they're just on to the next greenfield project. In that vein of thought, let me point out that you'll notice one common trait in many, not all, but many of those who object to the use of the repository. They all reference a third-party product called RavenDB. In fact, in this particular article, you can see Raven is present here. And in some cases, those objections will call to its creator, Allende Rahain. I don't know if I pronounced his name correctly. I believe he's the owner and the developer of a number of popular open source libraries like RhinoMox. He's also the developer of RavenDB, which is a commercial document-oriented database, which is a type of NoSQL database that's gaining popularity. And you can take a look at it a little bit more in Wikipedia. It'll give you a nice rundown of what they are. There's also this video here on YouTube where Allende is speaking at a conference about this recently. If nothing else, it should help you see both sides of the argument, so I'd refer you here as well. In a nutshell, instead of fighting the impedance mismatch between your domain layer classes and a table and relational database management system, what if you could just save your top-level classes in domain-driven design parlance, your aggregate roots, and then have the entire graph of objects related to the aggregate root at the same time saved or persisted somehow to your data access without ever referencing a relational database table. It would just store the serialized object graph as a schemaless JSON file, essentially. It could use XML or something, but you get the idea. Some sort of document into a document data store. In some cases, this could actually be faster than working with a relational database as well. So from that perspective, the repository makes less sense. Why abstract away the data access technology details when you don't even need them at all? Just call into an existing API that knows how to serialize the object graph filled with domain classes and saves them somewhere, you don't care, and can rehydrate them or deserialize them with a second call. No messing with table mappings and things like that. I hope I'm not misrepresenting the value proposition of RavenDB and other document databases or object-oriented databases. I've honestly never used that particular product. And I wish RavenDB and their team all the success in the world. The fact of the matter is that most of us will never use that product or any third-party data store because most clients want to stick with their existing investments in Microsoft products. They have an existing license, existing competency, existing tools, or legacy systems that are already built on top of SQL Server and the like. Organizations simply don't move away from investments in data storage and data access lightly. And unless you're working with a startup, you're probably not going to be able to affect that change inside of your organization. And so there's been this backlash against those who are anti-repository. Many of these wind up as comments or actually flame wars in blog posts. But there's a few links that address it head on, and they're all from this familiar source, the Sapiens Work blog. I'm not going to take the time to go through these, but the blogs that you want to look at are Do We Need the Repository Pattern? The repository versus everything else, and there's also one repository versus the document database I don't have here. And then also he has this say yes to the repository in your data access layer. So the third way that I would answer the objection to the anti-repository folks is to make sure that we're on the same page as to what a repository is and what it isn't. I'd agree that some implementations of the repository and the unit of work pattern seem pointless. My biggest concern is that some treat the repository as a commodity. We talked about this when we talked about abstract and generic repositories. If you recall, I had a lot of reservations about those. The fundamental problem with those approaches is that they shift the focus away from allowing the domain layer to drive the development of the system to something else. Most likely the tables of the relational database table that they're currently working with. This issue, I think I discussed quite a bit earlier, so I'm not going to really revisit it right now. But the final response is directly to you, the viewer of this series of videos, asking you, do you really need a repository layer? Well, don't just take my word for it or somebody else's word for it. Figure it out for yourself. Today, large long-term enterprise scale projects use repositories. If you're working on a large enterprise scale project, use the repository pattern. If you're not, then don't shoehorn it in if it doesn't make sense. But assuming you do use it, once you have a year or two building applications that utilize the repository and possibly the unit of work patterns as well as all these other variations on it, you will come to your own strong opinions about their value in your system. And that's great. But until you understand the issues for yourself, I would refrain from taking too seriously other people's opinions. Dare I say, even edge opinions on this matter. There was a saying years ago, nobody gets fired for choosing IBM. I don't know whether that was actually true or not, but the sentiment was that there are a few safe decisions out there. Stick with them until you have a valid reason not to. If I had a large-scale project that I was working on, I would definitely employ the repository pattern. Okay, so in the next lesson, I'm going to finish up this discussion of the repository, and then this series will be yours to consider. We'll see you there. Thank you.